All right, well, everyone, welcome to the Keynote. I'm John Callis. I'm a member of the Shmoo group. We like to have a wide variety of people to come and talk about hacking, particularly for our Keynote presentation. This year for our Keynote presentation, we asked Professor Ed Felton to come and give a keynote and talk about voting, because this, after all, is an election year, and it, after all, is Washington, D.C. Professor Felton agreed, and he also has graciously agreed not to give us the flu. So in his place, we have Alex Halberman, who's also worked on this. Alex has worked himself on some very interesting things like the Sony rootkit, the Diebold voting machines that he will be talking about, and also in the next week or two, he's going to be announcing some results that can't be discussed right now, but you'll hear about them, and you'll know that you got to see him ahead of time. So let me introduce Alex.
Thank you so much. So Ed Felton unfortunately can't be here tonight, and he told me yesterday afternoon that that maybe I could go in his place. So bear with me, please, if my presentation is a little bit rough or unrehearsed, but I will try to be as entertaining as possible and to be a good understudy for the fellow I study under. So tonight I'm going to talk about electronic voting. I think by now most of you are probably aware that there are some computer voting machines out there that some people have found problems with. Yes, there are. There are very risky machines, some of them still in use today. And I'm going to talk about the story of how we found some of those problems with the machines and what they are and what their implications are. But at the same time, I believe there's hope for using computers and electronics in the voting process in ways that will increase rather than decrease election security. And I'll also talk a little bit about that. Most of the work in today's talk is joint work with Ed Felton and fellow grad students Joe Calandrino and Ari Feldman. If it's any consolation, you should know that the grad students always do most of the work anyway. So the electronic voting problems that we've been suffering through in this country for the last few years really started in Florida. And they started in 2000 in the aftermath of the presidential election. You might remember images like this that I think have been burned into all of our minds about the problems they had with recounts. The word hanging Chad entered our lexicon. Catherine Harris, the Secretary of State, became a minor celebrity. Fun times. But in the wake of the problems they had in Florida, Congress passed something called the Help America Vote Act. And the Help America Vote Act provided almost $4 billion to the states to upgrade their voting machines on the condition that they do so right away, in time for the November 2006 election. The problem was that when the states went out and looked on the market, there weren't many appealing options that satisfied the requirements of the Help America Vote Act. Things like they had to be accessible to people with disabilities. The machines that most states turned to were things called DREs, direct recording electronic machines, which just store votes in some kind of internal memory. And the DRE voting machines that were available had been rushed to market very quickly with relatively few controls on the software engineering and security components. That was the genesis of the kinds of problems that would be discovered in subsequent years. But as we all know, a DRE is just a computer. If you open it up, you'll find a general purpose machine inside it. And desktop computers continue to suffer from many security problems despite billions and billions of dollars of investment. They suffer from bugs, from viruses, from hacker attacks. There are tools like rootkits that can be used to conceal malicious activity. And in a way, it would be a kind of technological miracle if these electronic voting machines, with so many similarities to desktop computers, suddenly weren't vulnerable to the same kinds of things. This is the Diebold AccuVote TS. In the last election in 2006, it was the most widely used electronic voting machine in the country. The company that makes it, So this is what the software running on the machine looks like. Diebold's software runs on Windows CE. On top of Windows CE, they run an application called Ballot Station that presents a user interface to voters. So if you vote on one of these machines, what you do is you walk into the polling place and talk to the nice old ladies at the desk who sign you in, and they give you a smart card that entitles you to one vote. You take your smart card, you walk over to a voting machine and put it in. You see a screen like this. After you insert your smart card, the machine deactivates the smart card so you can't vote twice. And then it displays some screens like this. You just touch the screen to mark each of your votes. And at the end of the election, you get another screen that displays a summary of the votes you've selected and allows you to finalize your ballot. Now, this machine makes no paper trail. The only record is in its internal memory. So you click the Cast Ballot button, and your vote disappears into the black box that is the machine. Now, given that it is a black box and that people in the computer security community suspected e-voting machines would have similar problems to desktops, many people wanted to take a look inside and see how it worked and whether there was any evidence of security problems. But Diebold, the company that makes the machines, for many years made it very difficult for people to look at it. They hid behind intellectual property law, forcing the states that bought the machines, for instance, to sign non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from inviting independent people to inspect them. They used trade secret law to intimidate people who might have wanted to leak details or blow whistles. Despite all of this secrecy, in 2003, someone working at Diebold had made the unfortunate mistake of making a tarball of their CVS repository and putting it on an anonymous FTP site. This is foreshadowing other security findings that later came out of the company. And researchers at Johns Hopkins looked at the source code and discovered some pretty alarming things. They found evidence that the machine would be insecure for a variety of reasons. But Diebold responded to this not by saying, oh, we'll fix the problems, but by saying, oh, those problems are in this old beta version of the software that you inspected. These guys don't have an actual machine to test so that they can verify that these really work in practice. They even resorted to legal threats against the researchers and attempts to undermine their credibility in the press. In spite of this, more bad news continued to come out of Diebold in 2003 when emails were leaked from the company that indicated their own developers had serious doubts about the security of the system. But the company tried to suppress these too with various legal threats. Things changed in 2006 when my research group was able to obtain a machine to study. We obtained it legally. Most of the work we do involves, very unfortunately, involves teams of lawyers, in some cases more lawyers than computer scientists. And our lawyers told us that, yes, it was legal the way we obtained it, from a source that asked to be anonymous. The machine was a 2002 version, but it was certified and used in actual elections. And we proceeded to use the freedom that this source gave us to complete the first public, fully independent security audit of a DRE voting machine. Now, I'll pause here for just a moment to tell a story about a little vignette about how we came to acquire the machine. You can't make this stuff up. In order to, well, I can't tell you who the source is, but but I was the one who actually participated in the handoff of the machine when we acquired it. This involved me dressed in formal clothes. I drove up to New York City in a white sedan and double parked near Times Square outside a hotel. I went into the alley behind the hotel, from where I received from a man wearing a trench coat a nondescript black leather briefcase containing the voting machine. There should be a novel someday. But anyway, this is serious research. This isn't a spy novel. And we had real goals in what we were doing here. We wanted to make sure we conducted an independent audit. We wanted to confirm the findings of the previous researchers who had looked at the source code. We wanted to verify whatever threats we found, not just by writing in some academic ivory tower way that there were potential threats here or there. We wanted to actually build demonstration attacks that we could show people so that it would be beyond dispute that certain problems could be exploited in the actual hardware used in elections. And finally, we wanted to figure out how it might be possible to do better than Diebold was already doing, even within the constraints of the practical requirements for elections. So what's the first thing that any hacker does when he gets a new toy? Well, he takes it apart. This is what was inside the Diebold machine when we took it apart. This is the motherboard. You'll see it looks a lot like, maybe like a little bit like a laptop, maybe more accurately a hybrid between a laptop and a little Windows CE PDA. It has 32 megs of RAM, an SH3 CPU, some flash memory, and PCMCIA slots, as well as other components, a system controller that's a standard Windows CE device. That's the unlabeled chip there near the middle. But we were faced with a puzzle when we found this. So you're given something like this, and when we turn on the machine, it just boots into Diebold software. We can't break out of it easily. Its software is in some flash chips on the motherboard. How are we going to get the software out to study, or even to find a way to break into the administrator features in order to set the machine to run a new election? This was very different from, say, just trying to root some Linux PC you have access to, because we didn't even have a way to, we didn't have an easy way yet to run our own code. We found one out, though. So it turns out that there was a slot on the motherboard, and I can't make the cursor appear on that screen. There's a slot on the motherboard there where that 128 KB EEPROM chip is. And it turns out that there's a way to reconfigure the motherboard by setting some jumpers so that instead of booting from its internal flash chip, it boots from the EEPROM chip. So we were able to take an EEPROM, program it with our own code, and boot from it just like you were booting from a CD-ROM or a floppy disk on a PC system. Except that we had to start with basically just the data sheets for the hardware and figure out how it worked. It's not socketed, so it's just a socket. So we were able to burn new EEPROMs and just plug them in. One of the things that our anonymous source asked us to do was to not destroy the machine, which we did, but just barely. It had it has two power supplies, an internal battery in case the power fails on election day, as well as a normal power supply. And one time late at night, putting the case back together after switching out the memory, I attached the battery connector upside down, and some of the smoke got out. Luckily, this only affected the battery charging circuit, and the machine was still usable. So with that method of booting the machine, we were able to get the state out. And we proceeded to disassemble the code that was already in the machine. This required a lot of time in IDA, which, if any of you are not familiar with IDA, it's one of the most beautiful programs, the interactive disassembler, and it lets you take take binaries apart almost as if they were the source code that produced them. One of the first things we did in IDA was we found out how to write to the external to the PCMCIA cards. So we developed a technique for backing up the state of the machine. We wanted to have a pristine copy of all the software there so that we could say with confidence that any problems we found later were caused by the software as Diebold shipped it, not by any changes we made in the process of hacking it ourselves. So we found in, yes? Mm-hmm. So the EEPROM was 128 KB and just stored a bootloader. The rest of the system software, including Windows CE, a second copy of the bootloader, which was what normally booted, the voting application software, the ballots, and a copy of the votes, all lived in the internal flash. The way the machine is used during an election, there's also a PCMCIA card inserted that is used to first load the initial ballots into the machine and to keep a copy of the votes that are cast during the election and then to take them out at the end of the election. So that's the memory architecture in a nutshell. So we reverse engineered some parts of the software using IDA. Other parts of the software we reverse engineered using a combination of the source code that had leaked and doing a limited amount of disassembly to see what had changed. And we found out many disturbing things about the way the software was written. I will give the highlights in a minute, but I just want to give an example of the level of detail that some of these problems occur at. The machine, when it makes a record of the votes that are cast during the election, it stores them in an encrypted file. The law in some states required this apparently, so the company implemented it, but they seem to have implemented it in the most insecure, almost the most insecure way possible. So what did they do? Each ballot record consisted of a ballot ID and just a vector of bits that indicated the choice for each race. Diebold decided that the way they would encrypt this is they would use DES in CBC mode to encrypt it, and then along with the ciphertext they'd store a 16-bit CRC of the plain text. What are the problems with this? I'll go through just 4 or 5 of them. Well, first they're using DES, which is just about the most vulnerable cipher in common use. Is that fair to say? The second problem is the key they're using for it is the same in every voting machine, everywhere in the country, and it's hard-coded into the source. That's right, a number define. What? They use that as a password elsewhere, believe it or not. But that wasn't the key. The key, actually, the key for one of the keys that was found in the source code was a number define string. It wasn't actually hex encoded, but it was some hex characters in a character array, so that it had even less entropy than you might expect. Second problem is this ballot ID. So one of the requirements in a voting machine like this is that it keep the it maintained the secrecy of the ballot so that voters can't be, so that people can't find out how you voted. Diebold assigns a ballot ID to each vote. Now, luckily, it's not just the order in which they were cast. If it were just a linear, if it were just an incremented serial number, then it would be trivial to just look at them and find out that this was the 5th ballot cast on Election Day. Then you can go look at the log at the polling place of who signed in and find the order that people signed in and identify the 5th voter and find out how they voted. But the ballot ID that Diebold uses is almost as bad. It's the output of this, this linear congruential generator that happens to have the property that the next number that it outputs is a deterministic function of the last number that it outputted. So given one ballot ID, you can find the next ballot ID and the next one and so forth. And therefore, you can find out with all of them the complete order. It's a little worse than that because they happen to store the ballots on the disk in the order in which they were cast, just with randomized IDs. The next problem, of course, is this 16-bit CRC. So it's like, what were they thinking? CRC is not a cryptographic authenticator. It's not keyed. So given you can make up a CRC for whatever for whatever ballot ID and vote contents you like. Furthermore, it's only 16 bits. So it's likely that by the birthday paradox, there are going to be a number of ballots in a given election that have the same CRC, and you could just replace or duplicate the contents in order to partially fool the machine. Maybe most disturbingly, though, this CRC leaks information about the contents of the encrypted ballot, and we were able to come up with some attacks that used that to learn partial contents of the vote. That problem is made worse because Diebold apparently copied the code for the CRC16 algorithm out of a very old book that still assumes 16-bit integers. So when they implemented it without changing that assumption, they did it in such a way that the machine leaks not 16 bits but 32 bits about the contents of the encrypted ballot. They actually store 32 bits, the 16-bit CRC and 16 higher bits that are part of the intermediate calculation. So that really made it so we could defeat the encryption very robustly. But that's just a minor example of how thoroughly broken this was. So our actual major findings, first, were that malicious software running on the machine could steal votes undetectably, altering all copies, backups, and logs. There's no special memory protection hardware. There's nothing except Windows CE software that gets basically running as root on the system. I think we can show a very quick video now so that Ed Felton can have a telepresence. This is a demonstration that we did of this vote-stealing attack one morning for Fox News. Now, mind you, this is live on the air, so we're all sweating bullets, even as we're hoping the demo will go correctly.
That's right. Joining us right now, Princeton University professor Ed Felton with the demonstration from his study. Good morning to you, Ed. Good morning. Also, right over there across the studio, you've got the two kids from Princeton who actually did
this is the problem with demos, right? You have to appease the demo gods by doing it twice beforehand. If you only do it once, it's guaranteed not to work. Can we take only a few seconds to insert a computer virus?
60.
Are the electronic voting machines used across the country vulnerable to hacking? One professor decided to find out for himself.
That's right. Joining us right now, Princeton University professor Ed Felton with a demonstration from his study. Good morning to you, Ed.
Good morning.
Also, right over there across the studio, you've got the two kids from Princeton who actually did this work, Ari and Alex. Now, tell us, 5% of the country votes with machines like this, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you are able to hack into it in 10 seconds.
It takes only a few seconds to insert a computer virus into this voting machine.
But how technologically savvy do you have to be a hacker to do this? I mean,
you have to be able to write computer programs,
yep.
Which a lot of people can do.
Sure.
You need to be able to open up this door on the side, which anybody can do, and that's about it.
All right, let's see how it works.
Yeah, you want to show me, if I'm voting, what happens, how it goes wrong, you say?
So we have set this machine up. We've infected it with our virus in advance.
Okay.
And we're running a simulated election here between George Washington and Benedict Arnold.
I think I know who I'll vote for.
All right.
Go ahead, pop it in.
I'm on your side.
In for you.
Okay.
And just wait a second.
So when I go to vote at an electronic voting machine, it looks similar. It's just like this.
Just like this.
5% of the country.
Okay, so I say start.
Yes.
Yep, I want George Washington.
Yes. Okay, good.
Okay, now I do next.
Next.
All right.
And cast ballot.
And I see that has registered my vote correctly.
Right.
George Washington, I'd like to cast my ballot. Very simple.
All right. Now, I'm going to vote.
Just a minute.
All right. So every person gets a different voter access card, right? All right.
It takes a minute.
And loading base. All right. Start. I'm voting for George Washington. Okay. Cast ballot.
There you go.
Okay.
All right.
Now I'm going to cast a third vote, also for George Washington.
All right. Well, we're going to watch just to make sure.
All right. Watch very carefully.
Loading ballot. You're starting. You're voting for George Washington. Okay, good enough. And then you cast your ballot.
So there should be 3 votes for George Washington.
3 votes for George Washington.
What are we going to see?
But because you have infected this machine with a virus, perhaps George Washington will not be the winner.
Perhaps right.
All right, so now you're putting in the supervisor
I'm putting the supervisor card. Now it's the end of election day, and I'm the election worker. We're going to count the votes.
Yep.
All right, very good.
So I stick this in.
Yeah.
And it takes a minute. I need to put in the highly secret PIN, 1111.
Okay, there you go.
I think you just accidentally said that out loud. Okay.
Okay, ballot station.
Not secret anymore. I'm going to end the election.
Okay.
And that's okay with me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And now I'm going to print the results on this printer.
Okay, quickly, very quickly.
Yes. And the results will come out. So here's what happened.
Yeah.
Inside the machine, it was keeping an electronic record of every vote.
Right.
3 votes for George. But the computer virus went and switched the votes inside the computer's memory.
All right.
And when you see this result, what you see, look at the tape right here.
Hold it right there very carefully.
1 vote for George Washington and 2 for Benedict.
So you're saying that hackers would have had to have done this before people voted. They would have had to have infected it with a virus, and then it skews the results.
Before Election Day?
Oh, my goodness.
Anytime before Election Day.
Ed Felton, Professor of Computer Science at Princeton, we thank you very much. By the way, when we come back, we're going to read the statement from Diebold. They say, the maker of this, they say, flawed information.
So this is what you would have seen in that video if you could see it more clearly on the monitor, that George Washington wins in the paper tape, and in fact that's the result reflected in all the electronic records inside the machine. Do you have a question? All right, I'll get to that. So we developed, just talking about the software running on the machine and what it can do, we developed a user-friendly version of the vote stealing. Of course, a real attacker would probably do something more subtle. So our second finding is about how software can get into the machine. It turns out that anyone with physical access to either the machine or its memory card can install malicious code in as little as 1 minute. Now, the machine has one physical let me back up. The way that we can install malicious code on this machine, the attack we developed exploits a vulnerability in a service mechanism that Diebold provided for upgrading the code that they've installed. So this is another example of the security of the machine's design. If you insert a PCMCIA memory card containing a file with a certain name, when you turn on the machine, it reads the file and replaces all its internal memory with the contents of that file. There's no authentication, there's no password. The user doesn't even have to press a key or touch the screen. It's basically they're rooting themselves for you. There's one protection, I should say, and that's a physical protection. There's this locked door on the side of the machine that covers up the memory card slot. And you need a key in order to open it. Now, well, it's worse than that. it turns out the key is the same in every voting machine, much like the cryptographic key was the same. Every machine in Maryland, every machine in Georgia, for instance, where the machine was used statewide when we did the report, uses exactly the same key. What's more, the lock is very easy to pick. Back when we were doing this work, it took me a couple seconds. Other people have since done this with a paper clip in a couple of seconds. It's basically a filing cabinet or a desk drawer lock. You don't have to bump it. You have to sort of nudge it, I think. But it gets much worse. There's the card coming out. So I'll tell another story here. When we first demonstrated our attacks against the machine at Princeton, just in our own department, afterwards, one of the members of our technical staff came up and asked to take a closer look at the key that we had used to close the machine. This fellow, Chris Tenji. And he said, I think I have one of these at home. And the next day he brought it in, and the key he had at home opened the voting machine. It turns out his key came from an old VAX system. And we were really confused. How could it be? Is this just a coincidence? So we did some research, and the key has some numbers printed on it, and if you put them into Google, you find out that the key is widely used and widely available on the internet. It's used for such high security applications as jukeboxes and hotel minibars. The exact same key. So we all bought one. I have one on my keychain here. This one came from a jukebox. So that was reported elsewhere. That was, I believe, that came from the vendor's own disclosures. So on the website you can order them. So here's the website where you can order them, and it gets worse. I think some of you have figured out. Yes, so a reader of Freedom to Tinker, the blog where Ed Felton and I write, emailed us to say that he noticed Diebold was selling the keys on its site. Now, they wouldn't sell one to him. He tried, and they insist that you already have an account with them, that you've bought some machines or something. But he noticed instead this very high-resolution picture of the key showing just how it was cut. So he went to Home Depot and bought some blank keys and filed them down in his basement and mailed a couple of them to me. And they worked. So they didn't get the physical key any better than the cryptographic key. I think they finally took down the picture after we blogged about it. So that was the second finding. The third finding that was alluded to in the video, and in many ways is the scariest of all, is that malicious code can spread in the form of a voting machine virus from machine to machine. And this is during normal election procedures. So how does the voting machine virus work? Well, to oversimplify things, if you put in a memory card into an infected machine, the machine copies a file with the name of the software update file to that memory card. If you boot another voting machine with that memory card in place, Diebold's own software update mechanism installs the update, infecting the machine with the virus, and the cycle continues. In practice, the memory cards are moved between voting machines quite often. They're moved from machine to machine before the election to load the ballot design into each machine. They're moved after the election to aggregate and tally the results. And in most states, there wasn't a lot of control on which machine got which card. Over the course of a few election cycles, a small number of election cycles, it would be trivial for a virus to hitch a ride on these normal shufflings and aggregations of memory cards to infect perhaps all the machines in a county, all the machines in a state. And that is that's the horrifying thing. I have to say it again. A single point of infection, perhaps a conspiracy of one person, could launch a voting machine virus attack that would eventually infect all the machines in the state. That's a whole new level of potential for election fraud. It's unlike anything that we had seen in the past in terms of non-electronic voting. Let me tell you another really quick story. So the night before we went to Fox News to film that video, and later that day to CNN, we were trying to appease the demo gods and make sure that our vote-stealing attack actually worked. About 10 o'clock that night, we had a car coming at 4 in the morning to take us up to New York for the early taping. At about 10 o'clock at night, we found that our code wasn't quite working. Sometimes George Washington won. Now, we found the bug. It was some timing problem. We were voting too quickly, so the vote-stealing software didn't wake up and change the outcome in time. But when we updated the code on the machine, we were finding it still sometimes failed. Well, we eventually realized that the reason that it wasn't working was because the machine was infected with our virus, which was blocking software updates. And we didn't even know the virus was on there. We thought it was just a little bit of code that steals votes. But so these viral attacks can be tricky, and they can be extremely stealthy, even to their own creators. So this machine, I think we've shown, is unsafe, at least in the way it's used today. But the question that I think the public has to ask in response to this, as well as the technical community, is this just a fluke, or is this representative of electronic voting machines generally? We got a chance to find out last summer when Deborah Bowen, the California Secretary of State, convened a study of all the major electronic voting systems used in California. She invited teams of researchers from California, as well as my team from Princeton. Here are most of Ed's other grad students, to study the different machines. This was the first state-sponsored study, to my knowledge, where the researchers were given basically full access to the source code of the system and the ability to report whatever problems they found. So we spent most of the summer locked away in a secret lab with a safe and all sorts of other silly-sounding precautions, poring over the source code. We were only given 6 weeks to do the bulk of the analysis, to do the source code analysis, even though it was 300,000 lines of code. But in 6 weeks, we found quite a few problems, and so did the team studying the other systems. So my team studied the Diebold machine, a newer model Diebold than what we had studied before, and teams from California studied voting machines from Hart and Sequoia, 2 other vendors. The Hart team, they found two kinds of problems. They found attacks that would allow malicious code to be injected and potentially to spread virally from machine to machine. And they found a different kind of attacks that would let voting officials find out how everyone voted, violating the secrecy of the ballot. The Sequoia team found basically the same 2 categories of attacks, and not to be outdone, we also found viral attacks and attacks that would let voting officials find out how everyone voted. So all 3 systems suffered from remarkably similar vulnerabilities, and very serious ones. In response, California imposed significant restrictions on the use of all of the machines, and is working now to try to tighten security even further. So electronic voting is a security disaster as it's been implemented so far. It's not just a single machine. It's not just a single bug. It's a systematic failure across multiple vendors, across multiple layers of security, all breaking down. But the question is what to do about it. We have to hold elections. Some people have called for banning DRE voting machines or electronic voting machines entirely. But critics respond, won't that just return us to the bad old days like this? And there's something to be said for that. Electronic voting does have its advantages. I never thought I'd be standing here in front of a room full of hackers defending electronic voting, but here I am. Voting officials report that voters say they like it more. For whatever reason, it seems to increase turnout, especially among certain segments like young people who seem to find it more fun. It results in significantly faster reporting. All you have to do is press count. There are fewer undervotes and overvotes since the machine can report that you've missed an election and missed a race, or it can prevent you from voting for too many candidates. And it's more accessible. People, especially people with disabilities, people who are say blind or have very poor vision, feel empowered because with an electronic voting machine that provides audio output, they can suddenly vote by themselves independently for the very first time. And you might want to throw some balls at me now. I'm going to say that electronic voting can be more secure than paper-based voting. But so we can do better. So one of the ways that electronic voting can really help is when it's combined with paper. So electronic machines and paper machines together produce two redundant records. This already provides increased security because in order to cheat, you have to modify both of them if you want to cheat undetectably. And many voting machines now do this. They're touchscreen machines that have had paper trails added to them, where every time you vote, they'll print out a piece of paper and put it into a ballot box. And there are ballot scanning machines that let you fill out what looks like a Scantron test form and have it scanned immediately right in the voting place so that you find out whether you've made any mistakes and can see, with some of the better machines, you can see how the machine recorded your vote. All right, thank you, Sandy. You're going to report the insecurity of both systems. So there's more tomorrow with even newer voting results. Paper and electronic ballots also are useful in combination because they have complementary failure modes. So the paper ballot is vulnerable mostly to low-tech physical tampering, to tampering with a large conspiracy of people at the places where the votes are cast or who are able to tamper with the ballots after they're cast. And it's primarily something you have to do after the election. In contrast, electronic records, tampering with them requires a high-tech attack, a relatively high-tech attack, but only a very small conspiracy, as small as a single person. You need very little access, and you can do it from a central place, and it's possible to set it up before the election, perhaps years before the election. But redundancy and having different failure modes together can be combined to offer greater security, but only if we bother to use both records together in the course of the election. You have to check to make sure that they agree, or else having that redundancy doesn't help. So how to use paper records is the question. We could have a machine count the paper records, some kind of scanner maybe, but wait a minute, I just spent all this time describing how risky machines are in the voting process. The other thing you could do is you could have people count all of them by hand, but that has risks too, and it's also very expensive. Some studies of recounting the paper tape that comes out of DREs with paper trails have shown costs on the order of several dollars per ballot. It's amazing how expensive it is to do a full recount. So what's usually done in practice is you pick some random subset of the papers and just spot check to make sure they're right. But which subset is the question? So the standard approach in this fictional state, for instance, is to pick some precincts randomly some voting places randomly and just hand count the paper records in those places and make sure they agree with the machines in those places. This is pretty good. We can get ample statistical confidence. But on the other hand, it's relatively expensive still. You might have to recount a few percent of ballots. If it's a really close race, maybe even 10% of ballots to maybe more to get statistical confidence. But what you want to do in any case is make sure that you're confident enough that in answering whether if you counted all the paper ballots by hand, the result would still match the electronic tally. So here's an example. Let's say we have this race between Alice and Bob with a margin of 10%. We want here to reject the hypothesis that 5 or more % of ballots differ between the paper and electronic versions. So if we're going to do this kind of paper-based, this precinct-based recount, for a given size election, maybe we have to hand audit, say, 60 precincts. But this is expensive. Maybe it costs $100,000. And I'll give you, for comparison, a different method in a moment. So let's say instead of counting by precincts, we were to sample individual ballots. This is something that's been proposed by some people called ballot-based auditing. So that can enable us to be much more efficient. So here's a visual depiction of the statistical intuition here. On the left, you have this jar of 100 marbles. 10% of them are blue. On the right, 6,300 beads, and 10% again are blue. Let's say that all of them are, let's say that the marbles are precincts and the blue ones are places where fraud happened. The beads are votes and the blue ones are votes that were forged. Now you can see, now the single marble and the pile of beads are each a 1% sample. So you can see that if we take 1% of the beads, because there's so many more of them, we have a much higher chance of finding some evidence of fraud in that sample than we do taking 1% of the marbles. Another way to look at it is you have to take out fewer beads before you have the same odds of finding evidence of fraud. So if we were to apply ballot-based auditing to a state with a similar race to the one I just gave you before, to get the same level of confidence, maybe instead of having to audit 60 precincts by hand, we might only have to audit 60 ballots at a cost of $1,000 instead of $100,000. So they're potentially dramatic savings. There's one problem, though. In order to audit ballot per ballot, you need a way to tie each individual ballot to the record in the machine's memory that's supposed to correspond to it. That way you can tell, you have to audit not only an individual paper ballot, but an individual electronic record. If you can't establish that, that correspondence, then this method won't work. But how are we going to establish that correspondence? We could print serial numbers on all of the ballots. But that's not a good idea because serial numbers are going to compromise voter secrecy. The other thing we could do is we could print random numbers on the ballots. But again, there's no way for a voter to be able to know that this random number doesn't somehow encode something that could be traced back to the order in which they voted. I don't think I have to tell you why the secret ballot is so important. It's important not only that nobody can tell how you voted, but that you yourself can't prove how you voted to someone else, even if you want to. Because if you can do these things, then someone can coerce you into voting a particular way, or you can sell your vote. Of course, in practice, it's not so simple. Here's a video of me voting for John Kerry in 2004. That's on an old lever machine in Pennsylvania, on my camera phone. Now, this is legal in Pennsylvania, but don't try it in other states without consulting with your lawyers. But the point is that we need to find a way to establish a correspondence between paper and electronic records that doesn't involve putting anything on the ballot during the election that can compromise the secrecy of the ballot. In recent research, Ed Felton, Joe Calandrino, and I propose a new method for doing this that does so by bringing computers back into the audit process. So what we do is we start with a voting machine that puts out paper records and electronic totals. The paper ballots all look the same, except that the votes marked on them are different. This first step of our process is to check that the electronic records match the paper records using something we call a recount machine. So our recount machine looks like a high-speed scanner combined with a printer. So you can actually buy things on the market for a few $1,000s that look just like this. And we feed the paper records into the recount machine, the paper ballots into the recount machine, and it does two things. It scans each ballot and produces an electronic record of its contents, and it prints a serial number on that ballot and saves the serial number along with the record of the vote. So now we can go through and make sure that the totals that the recount scanner came up with match the totals that the initial voting machine came up with. And at that point we know that if the recount machine is behaving correctly and the totals match, then the paper and electronic records that came out of the voting machine must be the same. All we have to do is trust the recount machine. So how can we trust the recount machine? Well, that's step 2. What we can do is we can apply ballot-based auditing to the recount machine because now we have serial numbers on the ballots. But because we didn't serialize them, we didn't put numbers on them before people voted, only after they'd been put in a ballot box and reordered, these serial numbers that we printed with the recount machine can't be used to go back and identify voters. So here's how we perform the ballot-based auditing. We pick some ballots at random. We can even do this on a statewide basis rather than a precinct-by-precinct basis. Then someone goes and pulls those ballots out of the stack, and we make sure that they match the corresponding electronic records. So here's the system as a whole. First verifying with the machine that the paper and electronic records match, and then verifying by hand with random sampling that the machine's electronic record matched the paper records that it put serial numbers on. So now we've found a way that we can use a machine in the election process without having to trust it, to work correctly. And the result is something that can be efficient as the most efficient ballot-based auditing strategies while still protecting the secret ballot. And we can do a bit better. Still, we can use statistical tricks that take into account things like the contents of the votes in order to further reduce the number of ballots we have to sample. Say, instead of trying to reject the hypothesis that 5% or more of ballots differ between the paper and electronic versions, we can adopt a new hypothesis that says we want to reject, saying instead do at least 5% of the ballots that are marked for the winning candidate on paper actually have, electronically actually correspond to paper ballots that were marked for the other candidate. The question is, were enough ballots changed in the right direction to flip the election outcome? And if we take this into account, we find out that we only need to audit ballots marked for the winning candidate, which we can suddenly do because we now have an electronic record corresponding to each ballot that tells us what votes are marked on it. So using this technique, we can do much, much better than existing election auditing techniques. In an actual race, this is the 2006 Senate race in Virginia, which had only a 0.3% margin of victory. In order to get 99% confidence with the method that's actually used in Virginia, precinct-based auditing, people would need to hand count more than 1 million ballots. Using our techniques in their most developed form with content-sensitive ballot selection, we'd need to recount by hand just a little bit more than 1,000 ballots. The rest of the work would be done by machines. So we can use these techniques to do audits much faster, much cheaper, and much more securely than humans can do today. And we hope that they'll be adopted more widely as people begin to trust machines when used correctly as part of the audit process. So returning to Florida once more, some states have already learned the hard way how important it is to have an auditable paper trail as part of their voting system. In November 2006, there was an election in Sarasota, Florida, using a DRE voting machine called the iVotronic. And in one particular race, there was a peculiar anomaly. This happened to be a congressional race, incidentally, to replace Katherine Harris's seat. It was the most expensive congressional race to date in U.S. history, in fact. And the anomaly was that on 15% of the ballots where people had voted with the iVotronic machine, the machine registered that the voter just left the congressional race blank. In other places, other parts of the state that didn't use the iVotronic machine, it was something like 3%. In fact, on these machines, the results showed that more people voted for the local hospital board than voted for the U.S. congressman. There was, to make matters worse, there was statistical evidence that showed, based on the demographics of the place where votes were missing, that if these machines had recorded a normal undervote rate instead of an astronomical 15%, the outcome of the election would have been different. A different candidate would have won. So you have some anomaly potentially costing a seat in the House. Were the machines hacked? Were they malfunctioning? Was it some human error? Perhaps bad user interface design. Perhaps voters in this particular place just didn't want to vote for the House. The problem is we'll never really know. In part because the machines didn't keep any paper records. The only records were inside the machine in electronic form, and they don't really tell us whether there's any correspondence between what the machine recorded and what voters saw on Election Day. Ironically, one of the items on the ballot that day was a referendum to require that Sarasota County adopt a paper trail for their e-voting machines. It passed, or so the machines said. So over the 2 years, year and a half since then, there have been many studies into this phenomenon, inquiries from inside government and without, lawsuits, but it's still in dispute even now. It's likely to be a moot question very soon, only because the supposedly winning candidate is now running for re-election. In contrast, look what happened in New Hampshire last month during the primaries. There was some similar dispute about electronic voting machines, where in places that used electronic machines, I believe it was that Hillary Clinton got more of the vote, versus in places that used only manual counting, she got less. Well, this could have been the source of major problems of voter confidence, except that New Hampshire has a law requiring paper trails, and they have very good audit procedures. An audit has already been conducted and has shown no major anomalies. In fact, this is probably just a statistical fluke or a factor of demographics. So people were able to regain confidence very quickly. Florida, since 2006, has adopted new laws requiring paper trails, actually mandating optical scan voting machines, which inherently have paper trails, and mandating random audits. So Florida is now ahead of the game. But there are still a dozen or so states that are using the dangerous voting technologies like the ones we've studied. And we can only hope that this year we won't have any similar problems. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Could everybody please stand up so we get good reception on the mic?
Which are the states that have the dangerous voting machines?
I don't have the. I really don't have that data in my talk here. I wish I could rattle them off the top of my head like Ed probably can. You'll have to take a look at some of the voting websites to see which ones are still using paperless DREs. There are 23, Sandy says. New Jersey is working on it, though. It depends how you measure, I think. But there are. I know many places in Pennsylvania also don't have paper trails, including where I vote, where I come from, north of Philadelphia.
Regarding the virus attack, should it not be standard procedure to check some of the memory and then check some of the memory after the election is run to make sure that there's been no tampering?
Well, you'd think that something like that would be easy, but in fact the code that performs the checksum would have to run on the machine the way these machines are designed. And the virus could say, detect that the memory was in test mode and report a false checksum. Or it could try to use various virtualization techniques to hide in other ways. The software actually that already is installed reports things like a version number and a hash of the executable. But when we infect it with the virus, we just have it lie. It's as easy as that. You'd need some kind of trusted computing hardware, say, that ran outside of the normal machine to report this kind of thing, and no one has implemented that in a fielded system. Or something you attach, yes. So something like that would be interesting, and I think there have been some proposals that have or are just now coming out of the research community to even retrofit things like that into existing machines. But I don't believe anyone is doing anything like that in practice. One more?
Did you give any of your research to the Black Box Voting Project or VoterGate?
Or VoterGate? I think they're well aware of it. Bev Harris knows about our work. We emailed with her very shortly after it came out, in fact.
In the machine-assisted scheme, yes. Isn't the stage of having people do the reordering of the paper a bit non-trivial?
So it depends how much you demand that they be reordered. If it's just, it doesn't take much reordering, I think, to destroy, to make the really simple attacks much harder. You just need to a fairly small amount of shuffling. In order to have really strong security, you'd want to know that it's a completely random permutation, which is much harder in practice. But to make it leak much less information, I think would just require the normal amount of shuffling that would happen when people slip the paper into a box and maybe tossed it around a couple times before scanning.
Did you do a comparison between the code that was up on the FTP server that was publicly available versus the code that you got in the California tests, and what major differences were there?
So the code we tested in California was quite a bit newer. It was, and the differences were, well, it was, by that time the code had evolved a lot. There were many new features in the machine. I would say there were places where it had been improved, but also places where there was just a lot more cruft that had been added. I don't think that the overall quality of the code was improved. We found a number of buffer overflows that were exploitable in the California study, different ways that viruses could spread through the machine even without taking advantage of bootloader vulnerabilities. So the code was not good. And we talked with engineers at Diebold as part of this and just tried to ask them, well, what happened? How is it that problems like the ones we found slip past your quality assurance? And what they told us basically was that they don't have people on staff whose job is security. They don't have people who have extensive security backgrounds. They don't do threat modeling. They don't do any kind of high assurance engineering. Security for them was something they thought about, but they didn't think about in any kind of consistent way. And that's why the code just reflects that all over. It's inconsistent. They get things wrong. They get things wrong on layer after layer. And it really didn't improve. The parts that were outsourced were worse than the parts they did in-house, if that's any consolation. Except for Windows, which probably was the most secure part of the box.
Thank you very much, Alex, for making the trip down here at short notice. For those that don't know, the Shmoo Group was originally an Alaskan kind of collection of folks, and every year we try to give people a very Alaskan gift. I think the first year I actually got moose nuggets, which is a colloquialism for moose poop. So this is a slight step up, although since we got this printed after or before Ed fell sick, it's got Ed's name on it, not yours, so I'll leave it to you as to if you're going to scratch it out and say, no, they really gave it to me, or you'll return this to Ed. But this is an engraved gold pan from actually Anchorage, and it's for Ed and now Alex. So thank you very much for making the trip.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of notes. I think you need to get out of town tonight is your goal. So I know the normal inclination is to bum rush the speaker afterwards, but try to make sure he makes his train because it's a real tough slingshot up to Princeton from here. Other than that, Hacker Halo practice is going to convene in this room, and for the rest of you that aren't going to do that, we'll see you all bright and early tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.